So in this conversation, I speak to Rob Howard, who is the founder at Howard Development Consulting, and he is also the founder of Innovating with AI. Rob has over 20 years in this industry of consulting in the tech industry, building in the tech industry, teaching people how to build apps, teaching people how to build consulting businesses. And now, over the past couple of years, he's combined all of this experience and he's added AI to that as well on top of that. So he now runs a variety of businesses, one of which teaches people how to become AI consultants and how to build AI businesses. He is probably the most technically knowledgeable person that I've ever spoke to personally. And he has a unique understanding of how to train people, how people learn, and what is the kind of best methodology of actually getting an AI business up and running. So if you're interested in anything to do with kind of entrepreneurship and want to combine that with the power of AI, or you want to become an AI consultant, or you just want to see how this process is done, then this is the perfect conversation with you. I hope you enjoy. All right, we are back for another episode of AI Tool Report Live. I'm really excited to welcome today's guest who I've worked with personally for around a year now, I think is correct. So I want to introduce Rob Howard. How are you going?
Hey Liam, thanks for having me.
An absolute pleasure. So I mean, there's a lot that I want to get into today. I want to get into innovating with AI. I want to get into HTC. I want to get into your background, but I want to start with some research I've done on you. And I looked through your LinkedIn profile, and all I could see was writer, developer, head developer, writer, editor-in-chief, developer, head developer, and that was just like the history of where you're kind of coming from. And it really reminded me of that Naval quote. So learn to sell, learn to build. If you could do both, you will be unstoppable. How true does that ring for you in your experience?
Yeah, great question. So, my experience has been that, tech skills are great, but they're really not enough to build sort of that full, well-rounded career that I'm going for. If you look at my history, as you mentioned, you see sort of a mix of writing, communications, advertising, and journalism with tech, coding, web development, software consulting. So I think, part of it is just that's my things. Those are the things that I like and my skill sets that I've built over the years. And, but basically, from a software development or software consulting standpoint, the more you can get good at communication, whether that's verbal or written or, any combination, the more you're going to stand apart from your fellow sort of computer scientists, right? We always kind of joke with clients like, a lot of our competitors are sort of like that, like coding in a dark basement type. And, among my clients, like they really want to see somebody who can be persuasive, be interesting and fun, join those meetings, in a way that is, valuable to them. So having that combination of, verbal and communication skills along with coding skills and tech skills, for me, that's always been kind of a, magic combination. And that's where a lot of my work has been focused over the last, 15, 20 years.
And is that something that's always been present for you? Or did like one of them come before the other? Because I can see from your history, you started when you were 12 years old, from what I understand.
Yeah. So I think, you could probably argue which one was first in either direction, but basically, I was always a fan of computer games and, fan of computing in general. So this was like 1992 to 1996, basically, when I was like in, elementary and middle school, So I was like, hey, I enjoy computer games. Computers are a relatively new thing. Like AOL is a new thing, right? So I would learn how to use computers based on that. I had a friend when we were in, maybe 12 years old or a little bit younger who had learned HTML and he taught me HTML and we started making websites and, building sort of like point and click video games with like Visual Basic and stuff like that. So the tech stuff was always a hobby, right? And the coding was always a hobby. At the same time, I really enjoyed writing. I was like, student newspaper guy and all that. So I think both of those things existed pretty much back into my teenage years. And what I discovered, as I went through college and sort of the first round of career stuff was that the combination of those two was really valuable to a lot of people in the market, so to say. So I always enjoyed both. I definitely focused on one over the other at different times over the years, but I think I was just fortunate that two things I liked doing worked really well together. And obviously, like, the rise of the internet was happening sort of concurrently with my teenage years. So I wouldn't say that one has really been that one really predated the other by a lot, but they always sort of worked in tandem with one another.
I can imagine that being really effective. I mean, the majority of people I know are one or the other. A lot of friends that work within big banks, they purely do coding. They work within these kind of small project teams, and that's all they do all day. Or people that are on the other side where they're maybe writing for a publication or journalism stuff, and that's all they do one day. So it's a super unique kind of collaboration of traits there. I'm wondering, so from your website, it says that you kind of first started innovating in 1999. Can you tell me about those kind of first couple of projects and how you kind of use both those skills to start with?
Yeah. So when I was, maybe a sophomore in high school, the PlayStation 2 was about to come out. So this gives you a little bit of, sort of mapping that back to like the late 90s, early 2000s. And, I had already been, building websites for fun for years. Like, I had like a fan site for my favorite band. And, I would like write little music reviews and link to like affiliate links and stuff like that. And then I'd be like, oh, I got free CDs like in the mail because of my affiliate links, right? So what happened at the end of the 90s was I started a PlayStation 2 fan site, which just blew up, right? Because it was one of the first of its kind. It was obviously a very big deal at the time among people who liked tech and gaming. And that actually became like my job in late, high school, because, I was bringing in advertising revenue. I was writing articles every day. I had a friend who, he and I would like read like the Japanese newspapers as best we could and like download the screenshots and post them in English. And, it's just like this like whole little crazy like world where, I was 15 at the time. And this website, in addition to making money, got written up in Entertainment Weekly when I was 15 years old. And they were like, yeah, this is a great site to learn about PlayStation 2 and all that. So that really launched the sort of like, me being able to have an internet career idea in my head. And obviously, like, that was before blogging even, really. Like, I didn't even have anything like WordPress to run the site on. It predated that. And I think maybe LiveJournal existed at the time, but it was very, very early in those days. So that really was sort of the kickstart, right? And I somewhat ironically, like, when you look at AI, like, it was a very similar path where it's like, hey, like, this is something I'm interested in. I ended up being an early adopter to it, and then at the point where it becomes mainstream, like, I'm a couple years ahead because I started so early. So, you know, PlayStation 2 obviously was cool. AI is cool. Interestingly, the computer chips in the PlayStation 2 are the predecessors of the GPUs that, we now use to run language models and all that. So, kind of a fun, like, full circle there. But yeah, basically, like, you can see kind of where like coding and publishing intersected immediately. And then, I was always interested in journalism and advertising. So some of my first jobs were at major metro newspapers, being like their tech guy for stuff. And then eventually I transitioned to more of what I'm doing now, which is software development, software consulting, and now in the past couple of years, teaching AI consulting, and that sort of stuff.
I really want to dive into the AI and the consultancy and everything, but I want to get a little bit more background before we get there, just mainly around your kind of psychology. So you're talking about you're kind of running this business at 15, it's bringing in ad revenue, you've got Entertainment Weekly saying that this is a great website. What sort of confidence did that give you to kind of further explore that? Because I can see from your history, you've worked with the likes of MIT, Harvard, World Bank, Marriott. So was that something that kind of gave you the confidence to go and have these conversations?
Yeah, great question. So it definitely was huge, right? Because, Konami invited me to their office to like play video games that hadn't come out yet when I was a teenager, right? So, you know, that obviously like takes a lot of the imposter syndrome out of the equation. Like I still remember saying like, don't tell them that I'm 15. Like when I was like talking to like the Entertainment Weekly guy who's writing this article. So I was like very aware that this was like kind of a weird thing. It's actually much less weird today. Like I think that's probably like nobody would be surprised by this today in like the world of social media and everything. But it was weird then that I was so young. But yeah, it definitely was a huge benefit just to have that early validation. That being said, I did then go to college, got, a 4-year degree in advertising and American history. And I was like the student newspaper editor. So, I was doing stuff that was very non tech focused in college. It was much more communication focused at that time and, publishing focused. And then, after leaving college, I'd still been freelancing, doing freelance coding and all that stuff just to make extra money during all that time. And then I started to look at, well, what jobs should I get? And the newspapers that I applied to were saying, hey, we really want you for your tech skills. I was kind of leapfrogging over people because I had those tech skills that others didn't. And eventually I decided, relatively quickly that sort of the office life was not for me. I wanted to be a freelancer. I wanted to be an entrepreneur. So I think knowing, having a reasonably good idea that I could go out and make money as an independent freelancer or solo entrepreneur at a relatively young age um, gave me a lot of that. It gave me the ability to sort of make that leap where maybe I would have stayed in a more corporate job for longer had I not had that confidence. So, there's obviously pros and cons to that decision. If I were advising someone today, I'd probably say do both. Like take the job, but also do freelancing in the evenings and just, double up, right? However, obviously it worked out in the long run. And, by 2008, I was starting to sign those larger clients that you mentioned, like the universities and the, large organizations and stuff like that. So, some of that was just serendipity of knowing somebody whose roommate knew somebody and that sort of thing. But at the same time, like once you get rolling, you kind of have that, portfolio going. And like, if you've worked with MIT, then it's easier to get the next university or the next big nonprofit and that sort of thing. So, a lot of that is just the serendipity of like building that portfolio. But of course, there is also a system you can apply to that in terms of, well, how do you reach out to these organizations? Is it worth spending a year trying to sign a contract with a large organization, or should you be going more towards small businesses? And now that's something that I teach my consulting students today is like, how do you kind of build that portfolio while simultaneously like focusing on a sweet spot where you could actually make money off of, gigs that could happen in the next few weeks.
What did you notice about dealing with clients of these size in terms of communication? How do you like to run? How do you like to do business? And did you take any lessons from that into the genesis of HDC when you first started it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the great thing about, if you think about government university clients, the numbers are always much bigger, like the raw number in terms of like what they're going to pay for that contract. However, the flip side of that is that the procurement cycle is always much longer and much more difficult, right? So I think you could argue that even if you get paid an extra $100,000, you're also spending that much extra time doing bureaucracy and paperwork and stuff like that. And of course, they can be very difficult to win, right? As well. So, if you find yourself in a position where you can get work for those clients with a relatively small amount of bureaucracy, then they're going to be a great portfolio item. But there is a huge trade off, right? In that, it could take years to actually sign those projects. And I, have clients where it literally has taken years to do the procurement process. Like it's bizarre to me as a relatively like lean and small business owner that could be a real thing, but it is, right? So, don't underestimate the amount of sort of rigmarole that you're going to have to go through to get those jobs. But of course, the portfolio items are kind of second to none in being able to say, hey, I've worked with these big organizations. So there's a significant trade-off there. That being said, especially earlier in your career, if you can, get some of those credibility markers on your portfolio or your, profile, resume, whatever it is, that's going to make everything a lot easier down the road. So, it's worth it, but it's not necessarily a sort of plug and play process, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I think we found the same AI tool report just working with bigger clients. You need to deal with insertion orders and so much more paperwork. Whereas when we're working with startups, it's like, all right, there's a Stripe link, let's do that. And we'll have a
Yeah.
5 minute chat over Slack, and that's us running. So it's a lot more agile and lean. Um, when you first started, talk to me about, so from how you've described it, it's very much like it was an all or nothing decision. What you kind of say as advice now is like someone should do that kind of full time job and then start their own business on the side. But it sounds as if you kind of just went all in on HDC. So talk to me about the genesis of that idea and like what was your psychology at the time?
Yeah, great question. So, I basically went all in on not being in an office, right? Because I had a couple of different job offers from major newspapers within like, I started an internship right after, and then that turned into multiple job offers, right? So, we're 6 months out of graduating from college, and, I'm like, hey, do I want to uh, go work in an office, X number of hours a week, or do I want to not do that and kind of follow that path of, more solo entrepreneurship? I think I was probably, if I could look back on it, I was probably overly anti-office at that time. Like I think there would have been significant networking benefits to kind of doing the do both approach, which is what I would counsel people to do right now. Obviously, there's limits to that. Like if you're exhausted from a toxic job, then you can't really do a good job on your side hustle. But at the same time, like, I think there could have been significant benefits in retrospect. That being said, really what happened was there was about 5 years of experimenting and bouncing around. That included running a couple different, essentially like web design agencies with different business partners. Most of them were just friends from, college or, other areas of life who were, they were sort of the designers and I was the developer in the partnership. One of those also turned into a little startup that actually did really well. We ended up kind of selling it sideways where nobody really made a lot of money off the sale, but there was like millions of people registered for it. It got a lot of attention. It was a really nice sort of, trial by fire experience. So if you look at like sort of 5 years of bouncing around without really a huge amount of income coming in, that ultimately led to people asking me to do the thing that became HDC, which was, designers who ran marketing agencies saying, we really need a developer who understands design, who understands publishing. Could you be our guy to help us with that? Right. So ultimately, I created a solo company where the niche was helping designers and marketers with tech stuff. And, as you would imagine, that sort of combination of communication and tech skills was just a perfect fit for that. But really, that was the market asking me for a thing that I was sort of doing accidentally. So, I think that's another lesson is like, you know, it's kind of good to experiment and bounce around because sometimes you will hear things from customers or clients that you might not have thought of yourself, right? And I think we see that over and over again. I'm sure you guys have experienced that with AI Tool Report as well, where it's like, oh, that's actually a great idea that I probably would never have invented myself, but because I'm out there talking to clients, talking to customers, getting real world feedback, I'm not in stealth mode. I'm out here trying stuff and people are talking to me about it. That was a huge, piece of value for, finding that niche eventually. And that was 2009 where I started what is now my main, company, HDC or Howard Development and Consulting. And we ran with that niche for basically decades, right? And it was just a couple of years ago that we built out this sort of new line of business around AI, which is now innovating with AI. So, just discovering that, market need was something that happened relatively organically by getting out there, talking to clients, talking to customers, experimenting, and ultimately discovering kind of where that sort of sweet spot was.
I mean, something that's really evident in what you say there is you spent 4 or 5 years bouncing around. You built up this business that had millions of people online, but you didn't actually kind of make much money out of it. But you don't sound regretful about a single second of that because you're really kind of putting an emphasis on the experience that you've learned from that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you had asked me on certain dates in the last, 15 years, you probably could have pulled some regret out of me. But I think if you look at the long term arc, right? The idea is that your career is going to be 30 plus years long, right? So in that 30 years, like it is likely that industries are going to change and evolve. We've seen that with AI. We saw that with sort of the extreme hiring followed by extreme layoffs in the tech industry over the last few years since the pandemic. The pandemic itself, obviously, was a huge disruption in a variety of ways, and it pulled people out of the workforce. It also rushed a bunch of money into existing companies. So it was just like crazy disruption, obviously. So if you think about a 30-year arc, it is unlikely that if you start your career today, all the industries you care about are going to be the same 30 years from now. So you really need to go into it ideally with the understanding that you are going to have to pivot, you're going to have to refocus, and being sort of always devoting 20 or 40% of your energy to experimentation is going to pay off over the long term, because you can be pretty confident that the thing you're doing now is not going to be exactly the thing you want to be doing 30 years from now. But if you are solely hyper focused on today's thing, you're going to miss the boat on tomorrow's thing in a lot of situations, or you're going to feel like you're playing catch up. So, if I were to sort of craft a psychology for, a good 30-year career, it would be, spend a bunch of your time really hyper focused on being great at what you're doing today, but also spend a decent chunk of your time experimenting for that future thing, right? And we did that with the startup. I learned a ton from that, even though the money didn't really materialize, right? And I was able to parlay that into the next thing. Also, prior to starting innovating with AI, my team and I were doing a lot of experimentation with content-driven businesses like online magazines about WordPress, for example, online training about different elements of programming or about business and entrepreneurship. So when AI came along, we weren't like, hey, we should totally switch gears and start doing a content business or a training business about AI. It was, well, let's take some of the resources we've been putting into other types of trainings and just talk about this new concept, right? So that was another example of, we sort of had been playing around at the margins, not making a ton of money off of it, but then the switch flipped and now AI was a thing, and the amount of people in that market and the desire of the people in that market to learn or to pay for education, pay for these experiences dramatically shifted, right? So I think a lot of these things are um, always experimenting at the margins while simultaneously focusing on your solid cash flow business, right? And then that allows you to sort of pick up these serendipitous opportunities, because you're always sort of like you've always got a foot in the door, basically, on the new thing. And that being said, like there's lots of stuff that I didn't get my foot in the door on. Like, I was never into crypto. I was never really into mobile application development. So those are areas where I didn't experiment, and you could say that maybe there was a missed opportunity there. But I was trying to focus on the things that I enjoyed, the things that I felt were a really nice complement to what I was already doing. So you don't need to be in everything, but it does make sense for you, I think, if you're thinking about that sort of career arc of 30 years, to say, hey, let's focus on the now, but also be experimenting and kind of try to find those things where you might be an early adopter that it might pay off for you, somewhat unexpectedly in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting what you say about the experimentation, and based on what you've described in the first 20 minutes of this conversation, is that it's led by a natural curiosity as well, right? You're not forcing yourself to go out and learn these things. You're just genuinely
Yeah.
like, AI is the thing that kind of piqued your interest the most, so you followed that rabbit hole. Maybe crypto didn't appeal to you as much, and maybe mobile app development like just didn't click in your head. But it's certainly something I've noticed across the conversations I've had, even with Martin internally, as well as like the people that I see who have had the longest careers in this business or are going to have like the brightest futures are the ones that are actually genuinely naturally curious. And it's not just about making money. It's like, okay, I'm really, really intrigued with this thing. Let me explore that. And bringing that back to you and your context, I want to really get into innovating with AI and how that came to be. So, to give some context to that, tell me about the first moments you heard the words AI. What were your first experiences with technology?
Yeah, great question. So I think, like most people in tech, things like AI and machine learning had sort of existed. Like if you look back to like Google trying to categorize your photo album in like 2015, for example, like that was a variation of what exists now. But for me, uh, ChatGPT and GPT-3 back in November of 2022 was sort of the breakthrough moment, where we were just sort of like, holy shit, like this is a real thing that is meaningfully different than anything we've seen in the past, right? And then a couple months later in February, 2023, we had already had, as I mentioned, an audience. I think at the time, maybe we were between like maybe around 40,000 people on our newsletter. But that newsletter was focused on WordPress and other sort of tech and software development. So we weren't an AI newsletter. But in the spirit of experimentation, I sent out an email and I said, hey, do you want to learn about AI? And we just got like a crazy response, and I had been doing trainings in the past. I'd even done like speaking at freelance business conferences and tech conferences and stuff like that over the years. And I would teach, little tidbits of this and little tidbits of that around coding and how to get clients, how to have retainer revenue, stuff like that. So I had some experience with this, like, hey, do you want to learn X, Y, and Z question? And what we saw was just like the avalanche of responses was very, very different than what we had seen about other topics in the past. Looking back, obviously that makes sense. It was a big deal then. It's a big deal now. It's grown substantially, obviously, since then. So we had this first glimmer of like, we should do this, right? And from that point, we went through this process of saying, okay, what do you want to learn? We'll put together workshops, we'll put together, smaller courses and stuff like that. So, from February to sort of the end of 2023, that was a year of just evolution of what we were going to teach, how we were going to shape that. And towards the end of 2023, we ended up with a course that we call the Incubator, which is all about how to go from sort of zero to building an AI product or process, mostly with no code tools, assuming that the person is coming in with minimal, if any, tech skills and AI knowledge. So really taking you from 0 to 60, where, in the past, if you had come to me and said, hey, I want to build the next Uber or the next Facebook, like I would have said, okay, you're crazy. That's going to be like $1 million endeavor, right? But what we discovered is that students could actually go through this process over the course of a few months and come out with something really cool that is AI powered and pretty much entirely no code that they could then turn into a business or turn into something that they do for, clients or customers or whatever. So the AI Incubator was the course that grew over the, over the course of the year 2023. That, is still something that we're doing with students now. And now in 2024, we've also expanded into teaching people how to be AI consultants. So that was one that we launched over the summer, super popular so far. We're actually in the process of delivering the course live to the students who joined it in June and July. And probably in January, it'll be back out, into a new enrollment cycle for everybody else to join who wasn't part of that first cohort. So now we have sort of this pillar where it's teaching people how to be AI consultants, which is kind of a whole new industry that now exists that didn't exist 2 years ago, as well as doing the incubator, which is more around that sort of like lean startup or learning how to build your own thing, framework.
I want to touch on the consultancy in a second, but I want to bring things back to the incubator. And something I found really interesting is that you started with the market want. You started with that question of like, what do you want to be trained on? What are you most interested in? You started by getting kind of customer feedback. And my question for you is, how did you and your team then take that question and go out and actually educate yourself to the nth degree on that subject matter
Yeah.
to then go and teach it?
Yeah, great question. So we call that technique the 9-word email, right? And the 9-word email is like, hey, do you want to learn about AI or do you want to learn about X, Y, and Z, right? And then, that is a really simple way to do demand testing and to say, hey, is this something that I should pursue? And when you contrast that with spending hundreds of hours developing a course only to find that nobody really wants the thing that you developed, right? That is, a much more efficient approach. It's a little bit scarier because you're out there almost like pre-selling to people before you've created the thing, right? But it is much more efficient because, especially in a world that's moving as fast as AI and tech is moving, you really need to have that sort of agility and flexibility. We were already a bit ahead of the curve in February 2023, I think, with AI knowledge. But really, what that initial response said to me was, it's time for me to maybe shift 20 hours of my week over to just really deliberately becoming an expert on this, right? And you can think about sort of like the technology adoption curve where you're saying, hey, I'm an early adopter today, but in a year or two, the whole mass audience is going to be flooding in to this market. So it really would behoove me to spend this year getting really good, right? And then you are so far ahead of the curve that you're the expert, you're the person who can teach others, right? Um, there's kind of an old story or adage about a piano teacher who doesn't know how to play piano. And she says, well, all I really need to be is 3 or 4 lessons ahead of the kids that I'm teaching, and then I can be a good piano teacher, right? So that's a little bit frivolous, obviously. But the idea that you can be an early adopter and then teach people who are joining the market or the industry later on, that's something that you can apply to AI consulting today. You can apply that to any business in the future where the value of being early can make a big difference, especially in an industry like AI, where now you're seeing this flood of sort of mainstream attention. And you have folks like us who have been here for a couple of years now, where we can say, well, we've, tested all these things, we've learned all these things already, and now it's time for us to teach others. So at that time, I was already teaching tech skills, I was already teaching business skills. So it was just sort of a natural evolution. I didn't feel like I was starting from scratch in any way. However, I did dramatically shift my attention because I said, the world of software development in terms of non AI stuff is relatively stable right now. Like, I don't need to go out and learn a new programming language to improve my career, but I do need to go out and learn as much as I can about AI and machine learning so that I can be, a pioneer in that new area as much as possible.
Something I'm really curious about is the translation of that research to that finished program. So you're dedicating this 20 hours a week. You're obviously coming into this from a technical background. So I assume that you're kind of playing with different AI models, different LLMs, and then you're capturing this and then putting it into a no-code program. So how do you go about that translation to deliver that kind of final product that is no code that
Yeah.
people have to go through from a non-technical background?
Great question. So, I think this plays into a couple of things we already talked about. One is that sort of combination of tech and communication as being something that is just generally very valuable, right? And I think this is another example of where that's a nice sort of Venn diagram of skills where you can learn the tech, but also explain it to others. So I think that, is kind of a through line, through everything that I've done over the years. The other thing is that, I basically had 3 jobs for a year, right? So I was running my primary business, I was learning about AI, running secondary businesses. I had a small nonprofit that I was, doing a lot of work for at the time. So basically, like, you know, 2023 was a year where I was sort of taking that advice that I mentioned earlier, where it's like you should be doing both, right? So there was a lot more work per week. I leaned on my employees, obviously, to some degree to help with that. But it was a time of, transition, upheaval, and extra work, right? Now in 2024, I feel like I've had a lot of payoff from that extra work already. So I'm not kind of burning the candle at both ends. But, when you are in a time of, fast transition, whether it's industry wide or just in your career, doing more makes sense, right? You also want to do that with the context of, I'm not going to do this forever. Like, I'm not going to create a life for myself that requires 60 to 80 hours a week forever. But you may need to put extra in for a period of time. And that was definitely what I did last year. And then in terms of the delivery, everybody will have sort of different preferences on this, but I really enjoy delivering live workshops, basically webinar style. So we've done a lot of those over the last year. But what I discovered is that, teaching via webinar and then recording the webinar and then taking live questions during the webinar, what you can do with that is basically you're teaching it once to your early adopters, you're recording it, that can become part of your course in the future. The questions that first cohort asks are going to inform like the other lessons that you might delve into in the future. So, it's very similar to like, hey, if I'm a college professor, I'm going to show you the syllabus, right? And I'm going to plan my lectures. But like, if everybody has the same question, I might divert one of my lectures to address that question, or we might do extra work to address that question. So I very much take that sort of live and fluid approach the first time around. So last year we did that with the incubator. This year we're doing that live approach with the consultancy program. Next year the consultancy program will be largely available as a pre-recorded course because we've already done this once, right? So that allows me to give those first adopters different and more personalized experience, but also learn from them as well and create something that's really good for the second and third and fourth cohort, because it's based on real live feedback. And I'm not just sort of like doing lesson planning in a vacuum. So that allows you to be a little bit faster, a little more fluid. And I think actually ends up with a better final product because it's based on everybody's experience and feedback. So the people who show up, to that program a year from now are benefiting from everything that everybody has already learned, every question everybody has asked, everything I've discovered over the course of that time, creating that program.
And addressing all of these live questions through the live events and kind of shaping this, what were the biggest misconceptions people had about either AI or running a business? Is there anything there that really surprised you?
Oh yeah, great question. So I think one thing that surprised me is that one of the most common questions that we've had over the last year is, which model should I be using? And throughout the entire last year until like a month ago, my answer was always just use the most recent model from OpenAI because it's the best one. So I think, if you had, placed a bet a year ago, it probably would have been more on the side of like the models would be sort of battling for number one and changing positions a lot, right? Sort of like the, Olympic medal chart where, okay, now Google's ahead, now OpenAI is ahead, right? Um, but what I found was that really there was no change in which model was the best, except that OpenAI had released new stuff. So that probably was the status quo for about a year and a half. Now we're seeing that Claude is starting to take over that top spot, right? I think we could potentially see Google and Amazon take over the top spot in the next year. So, now we're really transitioning to a place where competition for the top spot is a serious thing. And all that money that the other companies who compete with OpenAI have been sort of dumping into model development, it's starting to pay off. So, model per unit prices are getting way cheaper, but quality is getting way better. So I think now we're starting to see that take off. Whereas over the last year, the most common question we got was, hey, should I be trying out Llama? Should I be trying out Claude? And basically my answer was like, like they're not really that different. They're not that much better. Like you're probably okay with staying with the leader for a while. Now I think we're going to see that finally change. But that was a common question, and one of the sort of perennial pieces of advice that I give people is like, wait until you wait until some other milestone before you ask me that question, right? So with consultants, I say like, that's a great question for after you've made $100,000 in sales. But before you make $100,000 in sales, that question is really not relevant to you because it's too in the weeds. it doesn't really matter when you're thinking big picture, right? And you know, we would get a lot of questions like that, you know, last year around the model choice. I think if you asked me that today, my answer would be a little different. But for the last year, I basically said, like, don't worry about it. Whereas, you know, if you look at the amount of content that has been written about like model comparisons, like you'd think that it was a big deal. But basically, what came out of all those model comparisons was like, just use ChatGPT, right? Or whatever the latest model was. So, you know, there's probably a few other examples of that, but that one jumps out at me as, you know, a very common question that, you know, the answer is basically like, don't worry about it, which is always a surprise to people. But, you know, the ability to stop worrying about something is really helpful when you have a limited amount of time and attention, right? So, you know, it can be very valuable to hear from an expert, hey, that thing that you're thinking about doesn't matter. It shouldn't eat up your time and attention right now. You know, and that frees you up to focus on more important stuff.
I mean, there's a certain degree of like the consistency of that question coming up is, in my mind, just some degree of procrastination, right? It's like people looking for
Yeah.
excuses not to move on to the next stage or actually do the work that needs done, um, which is super interesting. I can imagine myself doing it. It's like lording over like the font of your business or something else, like the intricacies of it before actually doing the work that needs done.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm curious why you transitioned from the incubator program to what you're doing now with the consultancy, because we start with this kind of like building an actual AI business to actually, I guess, giving people advice and advising other businesses on how to run AI departments and stuff. Tell me a bit about why you changed courses there.
Yeah, great question. So I would say that we haven't changed courses, but we've added a second pillar to the Innovating with AI offerings. So the incubator will always continue to be updated. We are going to continue to open enrollment in that periodically. And I think, you know, a healthy business probably has at least two, if not four or five pillars in terms of service offerings or product offerings. So that's where Innovating with AI is going over time. Like we'll likely introduce a third pillar in the next year or two as well. So if you have this pillar where it's about startups or solopreneurship, you have another pillar that's about clients, right? So you have customers on one side, clients on the other side. We found that there is overlap, but it's actually less than I would have guessed between the two programs. So we've seen a lot of people who said, you know, the incubator wasn't really the right fit for me, but I definitely would run a client consultancy type business. And obviously, there's some folks who say sort of the opposite, and some folks who are actually doing both, which is really fun to watch because we have some people who were really successful in the incubator that are now really successful in the consultancy program. But I think they address different types of people. You know, the type of person who would want to, you know, potentially build a startup or even just like build AI processes for their internal use. Like we have a lot of doctors who are in the incubator who are just building things that they write reports faster or they analyze data faster and stuff like that. They're just really building processes for themselves, right? So what we've seen is that there's not a huge overlap. Like there's a little bit of overlap, but they're very much serving, you know, different groups who are already subscribed to our more generalized, like, hey, learn stuff about AI type of newsletter and you know, content business, which is the, you know, the free component of Innovating with AI. So you know, what I see is that we'll always have the sort of products and processes pillar. We'll have the consulting for clients pillar. You know, maybe we introduce some new stuff in the next couple of years as well. And the two pillars actually complement each other too. Like one thing that we're experimenting with is having the consultants do webinars for the incubator students, and you know, they can sort of interact with each other in a way that creates this ecosystem of like, hey, I need help with this skill set. Oh, you can ask one of our other hundreds of students over here, right? So um, I see them as really complementing each other. And you know, right now, the bulk of my work is building and teaching the consultancy curriculum. But at the end of the year, we'll now have two curriculums that are pretty much built out. And then my work will transition to adding on to those, coaching students through our more personalized coaching programs that are kind of like the higher tier options for each one, and that sort of thing. So, you know, there's an ebb and flow of how much lesson planning I'm doing versus how much coaching I'm doing versus, if I'm doing a new marketing campaign and that sort of thing. But, ultimately, these are all going to be things that exist into the future indefinitely. So if somebody comes into our orbit a year from now, they can still benefit from the incubator, or they could benefit from the consultancy project or anything else that might come along down the road.
Thank you for correcting me on that and saying that they're kind of running in tandem rather than changing course there. I'm curious, I mean, like, you've spoke to, coached, mentored hundreds, if not thousands of people over your career. What are personality traits or kind of signals that you see that you know someone's really going to become a success? And then, as a second part of that question as well, could you maybe tell me about some of the businesses or individuals who have taken your course and then went on to use that as well?
Yeah, totally. I think, if I could wave a magic wand and give everybody one personality trait, it would be a willingness to get out of your comfort zone. So what we see is that, students, we do have some students who join, and we have a very flexible, grace period for this reason. And they say, hey, I joined on Friday. Now it's Monday morning. And I am not in my comfort zone and I want to escape this situation immediately because, they see I'm going to have to go out and maybe talk to people and do sales and stuff like that. So, every element, everything that will help you grow your, personal life, your business, or whatever combination, is going to require you to do something different, and that's going to be uncomfortable to some degree. Everybody has different tolerances for that, but the students who succeed are not necessarily the ones who like to take risks, but they're the ones who are willing to endure being a little bit outside of your comfort zone for long enough that it allows you to sort of change where you are on the map, right? So, there's kind of a misconception that good entrepreneurs are really, they have low risk aversion. They don't care about taking risks. And actually, the opposite is true. A good entrepreneur is highly risk averse, but is willing to push themselves into discomfort in ways that, have a high sort of risk reward ratio, right? So you don't want to be jumping off the cliff and, putting all your money in Mooncoin or whatever. That's kind of an insane risk, right? That's actually a bad idea. You're probably going to lose from that if you do that over and over again. It's like, playing roulette, basically. Sometimes you win, but most of the time you lose, right? So a good entrepreneur is going to be able to say, hey, this is uncomfortable. Maybe I've never been on a sales call with a client before. Maybe I've never, done a soft launch of a product before I felt it was fully ready. And those are things where the courses that we do really try to gently move you outside your comfort zone. So if you go into it knowing that and saying, hey, yeah, this is going to be kind of a workout for my brain, but in a way that will be good over the long term, that's going to set you up for success. And we do have folks who bail, and that's okay. I recognize that not everybody is ready to exit that zone. And a lot of the times they'll just say you know what, this is way farther, out of the realm of what I thought was possible for me. And I say, that's fine. We have a process built in for you. We hope that you come back in a year, read the free stuff and, get ready for it. But the folks who really succeed are the ones who are I recognize that change is happening. I recognize that that's a little bit uncomfortable. I'm going to have to do things I've never done before. But, on the other side of that, there is a whole new career path for me potentially. And the reward is significant for going through that process. So I think that's sort of a common thread through any learning or education. If you're in an educational program or a business program that doesn't make you a little bit uncomfortable, it's probably not going to be that valuable to you because you need to change something in order to have different outcomes.
I think what you could do is you could increase the price of every single offering you do by $500, and then as part of their enrollment, you send them an ice bath. And then if they keep the ice bath up and the psychological uncomfort, you're like, okay, maybe you're ready for the course now. That might be, maybe a way of doing it. So,
yeah, and we do, we do talk about it in sort of the marketing materials that people are going to see before they join. This is not intended to be vanilla sort of Instagram inspiration content, right? It is intended to be challenging because it's intended to create an outcome that is different from what you have today. So, you know, obviously with anything like this, only a small percentage of folks who are enjoying our free content also end up joining one of the programs, and we anticipate that. And we try to select for folks via our, marketing and our course descriptions. We try to select for folks who are going to be ready for that experience. And if they're not ready, maybe they'll come back in 6 months or 9 months or whatever, and they'll be in a different place. But, that's why we do it the way we do it. We want people who are ready to take that leap, and we recognize that not everybody is, and that's okay.
Taking things outside of this a second, you're obviously on the forefront of AI. You're teaching people, you're educating, you're also researching a bunch every single week. What are you most excited about in the space over the next 6 to 9 months? What have you got your eye on?
Yeah, great question. I think the biggest thing is video. We've seen these glimmers of what AI video is going to be able to do, but if you look at, where I saw this meme the other day, and it was like AI imagery 3 years ago, and it's like a drawing of an avocado or something. AI imagery today is like a real image of a person. So just like the growth in image generation, I think we're going to see something similar to that in video generation over the next couple of years, maybe even faster than that. So I think that's going to be really cool, a big shakeup. We already talked about the new models that are coming out, the models that are getting cheaper. That's going to open up opportunities for business models that were too expensive a year ago. Now, maybe they are doable with GPT mini and stuff like that. And I think the other big thing is mainstream attention, right? So, if you're watching the Olympics or the NBA finals, you're seeing an AI ad like every couple of ads, on TV now, which is big change, obviously, from a couple years ago. It's becoming more mainstream. I also think that somewhat counterintuitively, as it becomes more mainstream, people also are going to have the ability to sort of filter out the BS a little bit better. So if you think about, a couple of years ago, AI images were tricking people, right? And like getting like news coverage. Now people are just like, hey, this image is probably AI. And it's like, okay, let's do some research on that. So, the bullshit detector is getting better among sort of the mass audience, right? And I think for that reason, like, I'm way less worried about AI video being harmful because people are now attuned to the fact that AI can create imagery, AI can create video. There's AI bots on Twitter and stuff like that. So now that people are, I think, aware of that at a mainstream level, it takes away a lot of those um, sort of farthest, like long tail risks where you know, AI ruins the election or something like that. Like I think people have gotten over, people have become aware of the fact that AI can create false perceptions. And now that's less of a big deal in terms of the risk factors than it was a couple of years ago. So, I think all that, less expensive, better quality, more awareness, those things are all elements of AI becoming more mainstream, which I think is good for everybody, but especially good for the folks who are early adopters. Like I'm sure everybody who's listening to this podcast has been sort of obsessed with AI for a year or two, just like we have. So now we're the, sort of veterans of this industry, and we have the opportunity to teach lots of newcomers sort of how it all works.
Yeah, I mean, I think something for people not to forget is that we are still early in comparison to the masses. You said once every few kind of advertisements will get one about AI, but it's not as mainstream as it's going to be in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So it's
Yep.
something for people to keep in mind that you aren't too late. In terms of that, obviously you've got your eye on video for the majority, you've got your eye on the reducing API costs and stuff like that as well. But if someone's maybe just starting out in the space, where would you kind of recommend them to start? Like, what would you kind of give them as a general piece of advice when they first enter the kind of AI sphere?
Yeah, great question. So I think, the first thing you'll want to do is just familiarize yourself with how to prompt and how to talk with sort of the mainstream chatbots like Claude and ChatGPT. The next thing I would do is build something that makes your life better, right? So try to, actually create like a process or a custom GPT or maybe a little automation with Zapier or something like that, where it's like, hey, I used to do this manually. Now I just have a prompt that does it for me. So I would really try to get hands on early, because that's how you're going to learn. It's how you're going to get out of like the sort of listicle world of here's 10 ideas that might help you. And like, just, scan the listicles. That's cool, right? But go build something that is valuable to you, because that's where you cross over from it being theory to being practice. And I, think if you want to become a, industry leader or a person who is really knowledgeable about this, like jumping into building it is going to be a really valuable change. And I think, kind of parallels that get out of your comfort zone advice a little bit, where it's, don't just consume, but also do and build. And I think that's going to be the most valuable thing for somebody, you know, learn about it for a week and then try to do something with it, try to create value with it for yourself or for others.
Yeah, I mean, I love that as a piece of advice, and it's something I say just kind of framed in a different way is just start with a problem. Don't start with like, oh, AI is interesting, I'm going to go fuck around with the models for a bit. It's like start with an actual problem in mind and then use AI to
Yeah.
solve that problem. It's a much better
Yeah.
way of doing things. It may be counterintuitive, but it's the only way that you'll actually get a tangible understanding of the power of these models. With that being said, I'm just conscious of time, so I want to kind of round off our conversation with something completely unrelated to this, but maybe is as well. I kind of want to jump into, I guess, your motivation to why you do everything. So, something I pulled from your website, if you don't mind me kind of quoting you for a second. For me, that deeper meaning takes a form of ensuring that my team, my students, and I can devote more time to family, health, and relationships. That's why everybody at my company has the freedom and flexibility to take off at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday. They don't have to ask for permission, it's just built into our rules. I guess my larger question behind that is like, why do you do what you do?
Great question. So I think, where I come from, the perspective that I try to take on work in general is that, you know, our work and our businesses and our careers are a tool to achieve something else, right? So you want to enjoy what you do, but you also don't want the thing that is your work to be all consuming. And we have, so many stories of folks who are burned out or bosses who are sort of in their own sort of toxic burnout world who force that on their employees. In a way, the pandemic has made this more mainstream because there was such a movement towards, working from home and work-life balance. But this dates back to sort of the days of early remote work, digital nomad type stuff. The 4-hour work week, where I kind of said, this is a method for me to earn enough money and enjoy myself so I can go do life, right? And I think that, now, now that I'm building companies where other people work for me, where I have lots of, students who are also building their own companies, we've really hammered home on this idea of, um, you know, your business needs to flex around your life, not the other way around. And you should not be missing like important family events for work. You should not be unable to, take a day off because your kid or your parent or your spouse is sick or something like that, right? So, to some degree, these are obvious when you think about them in a vacuum. But I think, we all would acknowledge that, work-life balance and overwork and burnout are a huge problem, in every industry and in most places in the world. So, really focusing on this, especially now that I'm a leader of a company and I have employees who are sort of following my lead. It's my job to uh, set the right example and set an example that I think is going to create healthy and happy lives for everybody. So, I do this myself, but I also make sure that my employees know, like, yeah, you should be taking time off for that. You should not be working more than 40 hours a week. In the consultancy program, one of the pillars of it is, and you're going to do this in a way that doesn't require you to work more than 40 hours a week. So, as I mentioned, work and life ebb and flow. You may want to have two jobs for 6 months or a year because you want to transition or something like that. But the big picture is the whole point of what you're doing is that you can go have the family time, you can have the personal health, the relationships, the wellness, the time with friends, all these things that are more important than work. But also, it all requires money. It all requires income and stability before it really can happen. So, work can be fun. It should be something you enjoy. You shouldn't be dreading it, but also it should end, and then you should go live your life. So that's kind of the big picture that we try to share with everybody, whether they're employees or students or readers or anybody else in our orbit.
Yeah, I think you encapsulated it perfectly in the middle of that. And you said your business needs to flex around your life, which I think is an awesome kind of quote and something to kind of live by. If people want more great words of advice like this, they want to learn more about what you do, they want to learn more about AI, how do they find you?
Head over to innovatingwithai.com. You can sign up for our free newsletter there. You'll get free stuff. You'll get on our early access lists for our programs. And of course, I'm writing, at least weekly, sort of my analysis and, updates on the world of AI, in addition to, sharing our workshops, our education products and programs and all that sort of stuff. So innovatingwithai.com.
Awesome. I want to thank you so much for coming on, taking the
My
time.
pleasure.
I really appreciate it. I've learned a lot, and we'll need to run this back and do a 2.5 hour podcast at some point as well, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, I'm always up for it. Well, thanks. It's been great hanging out, and I appreciate you having me. And hope you have a great rest of your day. And I hope everybody, takes some good nuggets of knowledge away from our conversation.
I'm sure they will. I'm sure they will.